The wind in the high valley did not blow so much as it scoured. It came down from the granite peaks of the sawtooths, carrying the scent of pine resin and the darker, metallic smell of snow that was waiting to fall. It stripped the warmth from the earth and left the grass brittle, standing in thin, golden clumps that rattled against the legs of Jed Holt's horse. It was late autumn in the year 1889, but the season had already turned its back on mercy. The sky was a flat, bruised purple above the ridgeline, heavy with winter. Jed shifted in his saddle, grimacing as the movement pulled at the stiffness in his left knee. It was a bad knee, ruined 10 years ago by a green-broke colt that had decided to go over backward rather than accept the bit. The cold settled into the joint like a rusty nail, a constant, dull ache that marked time better than the pocket watch ticking in his vest. He rubbed a gloved hand over his thigh, staring out at the fence line that marked the northern edge of his property. The wire was slack in places. The cedar posts, cut by his own hands 20 years ago, were graying and leaning with the prevailing wind. It was a small ranch, tucked into the fold of the valley floor where the water ran longest in the summer. But it looked tired. It looked like a place that was slowly losing an argument with the elements. Jed pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat up higher. He was 60 years old, though the mirror in the wash basin usually showed him a man of 70. His face was leather-cured by sun and wind, mapped with deep lines around eyes that were the color of faded denim. He worked alone now. He had been working alone for 5 years, ever since the fever swept through the territory and took what mattered. He turned his horse, a steady bay gelding named Rusty, toward the rise behind the cabin. He did not need to go there, but he went anyway. It was a habit, like checking the cinch or spitting to test the wind. 3 wooden crosses stood on the hill, their inscriptions worn shallow by the grit in the air. Martha, Thomas, Samuel. Jed took off his hat, the wind immediately tearing at his thinning gray hair. He sat there for a long moment, the silence of the valley pressing in on his ears. It was a heavy silence, not peaceful. It was the silence of a house where no one laughs and no boots run across the floorboards. "I fixed the south rails, Martha," he said in his mind, because speaking aloud made him feel crazy, though he did it sometimes when the nights got too long. "The winter is coming on hard. I can feel it in the bone." He put his hat back on, pulling it low. The grief was not sharp anymore. It was just a weight, like a pack he carried that never got lighter, only more familiar. He turned Rusty toward the barn. The bunkhouse stood empty, the door latched shut. He used it for storage now, but sometimes, when the light hit the dusty windows just right, he expected to see his boys walking out, swinging lariats and arguing about who had ridden the best time. But there was nothing there but dust and silence. Jed needed supplies. The larder was low on flour and coffee, and he needed more cartridges for the Winchester. He hitched the team to the buckboard wagon, the wood groaning in the cold, and made the drive into town. The town of Bitter Creek was a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled against the wind, bisected by a street of frozen mud that turned to glue when the sun hit it. It was growing, fueled by the big cattle outfits that were pushing into the open range, swallowing up the smaller stakes. Jed tied the team outside the general store and walked in. The heat from the potbelly stove hit him like a physical blow, carrying the smells of roasted coffee, damp wool, and sawdust. 3 men were standing near the counter, warming their hands. 2 were young punchers from the Circle K, wearing chaps that looked too new and hats with expensive creases. The third was Silas Vane, the foreman for the Double Bar D. The Double Bar D belonged to Ralph Deering. Deering was a man who looked at a map and saw a menu. The conversation stopped when Jed walked in. The silence held for a beat, thick with the kind of judgment that belongs to small towns. "Well, look at that," one of the young punchers said, grinning. "If it is not the ghost of the valley, we thought you froze solid last week." "Holt." Jed ignored him. He walked to the counter where the clerk, a balding man named Harlan, was weighing nails. "I need 50 pounds of flour." "Harlan," Jed said, 5 pounds of coffee, a side of bacon if you have one that is not all fat, and 2 boxes of 4440 ammunition." Harlan did not look up immediately. He finished pouring the nails, taking his time. "We are running low on the good flour. Jed, I am saving the rest for the double bar D order. They have a big crew to feed." Jed felt the heat rise in his neck, but he kept his voice level. "My money is as good as Ralph Deering's." "Harlan." Silas Vane turned from the stove. He was a thick-set man with a face that looked like it had been chiseled out of granite and left unfinished. He had eyes like marbles, hard and unblinking. "Your money is old, Jed," Silas said, "just like you, and just like that scrap of land you were squatting on." "It is my land," Jed said, turning to face him. "I have the deed. I've been there since before you knew how to sit a saddle." "Silas." Silas chuckled, a low, dry sound. "Times change. Men move on, or they get buried. You ought to think about retiring. Holt, sell out to Mr. Deering. He is feeling generous this month. He might give you enough to buy a room in a boarding house down south, somewhere warm where old bones do not ache so much." "I am not selling," Jed said. He turned back to Harlan, who reluctantly began to gather the items, slamming the sacks of flour onto the counter with unnecessary force. While Harlan tallied the bill, Jed spoke, keeping his eyes on the clerk but pitching his voice so the room could hear. "I have lost a calf 2 nights ago, and a heifer last week." "Wolves?" one of the young cowboys asked, sounding bored. Jed nodded. "Big ones. I found the drag marks in the snow dust up near the North Ridge. And tracks. A lot of tracks." "How many's a lot?" Silas asked. "Too many," Jed said. "I saw sign for maybe 20, maybe more. They are moving in a pack bigger than I have ever seen. They are restless. They are not hunting like regular wolves. They are hunting like they are starving, but they are leaving meat behind." The men exchanged glances, and then the young cowboy laughed. 20 wolves? In a single pack? You are seeing things. Oh man, wolves do not run in armies." "I know what I saw," Jed said quietly. "You saw shadows," Silas said, stepping closer. "You are out there all alone. Jed, a man's mind plays tricks when the only company he has is the wind and a couple of ghosts. There are no super packs of wolves. If there were, a real ranch would have handled them by now." The insult landed softly, but it cut deep. A real ranch. Jed paid for his goods, counting out the coins with fingers that were stiff and scarred. He picked up his supplies, refusing to look at Silas. "Watch your stock." "Silas," Jed said as he reached the door. "I'm telling you, something is moving through the high country." Silas spat tobacco juice into the brass spittoon near his boot. "You watch your own stock, Holt, and watch your fences. Mr. Deering had the surveyor out last week. Seems you have been encroaching on the double bar D water rights. We moved the markers back to where they belong." Jed froze, his hand on the iron latch of the door. "You moved my markers?" "We corrected a mistake," Silas said, smiling thinly. "Stay on your side, old man. It would be a shame if you had an accident." Jed walked out into the cold, his heart hammering a slow, angry rhythm against his ribs. He loaded the wagon, his movements jerky with suppressed rage. They had moved the markers. It was the first step. First the legal pressure, then the threats, then the wire cutting. He had seen it happen to others. He drove the team out of town, the wheels rattling over the frozen ruts. The sky was darker now, the sun buried behind a wall of slate-gray clouds, about 3 miles from his ranch gate. Jed pulled the team to a halt. He wrapped the reins around the brake lever and climbed down, wincing as his boots hit the hard ground. He walked to the edge of the trail, where the sagebrush gave way to the open range. There was a patch of snow here, lingering in the shadow of a boulder. He knelt, ignoring the pain in his knee. The sign was fresh. It was wolf scat, dark and full of fur. But it was the tracks that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. A single paw print, as wide as a saucer, pressed deep into the crust, and directly on top of it, another print, and another. They were walking in each other's footsteps to hide their numbers. It was an old trick, but usually, wolves did it for a few yards. These tracks stretched out in a single, unwavering line toward the foothills. Jed brushed the snow away carefully. Under the top layer, The ground was churned. He stood up and looked at the horizon. The wind had dropped, leaving a vacuum of silence that felt expectant. "It is not just 20, he whispered. He climbed back into the wagon and whipped the horses into a trot. He wanted to be behind walls before the sun went down. That night, the howling started. It did not sound like the lonely, undulating call of a coyote, nor the usual communication of a timber wolf pack. It was a chorus. It started low in the throat of the valley, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself. Then it rose, voice joining voice, until the air outside the cabin vibrated with it. Jed sat in his armchair by the fire, his Winchester rifle resting across his lap. He had extinguished the oil lamp to save fuel, and the only light came from the red embers in the hearth. He listened. The sound was closer than it should be. It was just beyond the barn. He could hear the heavy, huffing breaths between the howls. He could hear the scratch of claws on the frozen earth. The wind picked up again, whistling through the chinking of the logs, arguing with the living things outside. Jed's hand tightened on the walnut stock of the rifle. He did not sleep. He dozed in fitful snatches, waking every time a log shifted in the fire, his heart jumping in his chest. The morning brought a gray, sullen light, but no attack. The snow had held off, but the cold was deeper. Jed spent the day reinforcing the barn door with heavy oak planks. He checked the horses, who were spooked and rolling their eyes, sweating despite the chill. He cleaned his rifle, oiling the action until it slid like silk. Dusk was falling when he heard the dog bark. Jed did not have a dog. His old hound had died last winter, but he heard the sharp, warning bark of a stray, followed by a yelp of pain that was cut short. He grabbed the rifle and threw open the cabin door. There was no wolf. Standing at the bottom of the porch steps, swaying slightly, was a woman. She was small, wrapped in a threadbare wool shawl that was black with grime. She wore a man's oversized coat that swallowed her frame, and her boots were split at the seams, revealing strips of rag wrapped around her feet. She held a small bundle tight against her chest. Jed raised the rifle slightly, not pointing it at her, but keeping it ready. "Who is there?" he called out. The woman looked up. Her face was thin, the cheekbones sharp enough to cut. Her skin was the color of copper, marking her as Mexican or perhaps mixed with the indigenous tribes of the South. Her hair was black and matted, escaping from under a torn scarf. But it was her eyes that held him. They were dark, almost black, and they did not flinch at the sight of the weapon. They did not beg, and they did not trust. They just watched him with a terrifying, exhausted stillness. "I am looking for the Holt Ranch," she said. Her voice was raspy, dry as dust. "You found it," Jed said. "I am Jed Holt." She let out a breath that was half a shudder. "I was told," she started, then swayed again. "I was told there was work. A man named Carson. He said he wrote to you." Jed lowered the rifle. "Carson?" "Carson died 4 months ago. Miss got kicked in the head by a mule." The woman closed her eyes. Her shoulders slumped. And for a second, Jed thought she was going to collapse right there in the snow. "Dead," she whispered. She turned around slowly, looking back into the gathering dark. The wind whipped her shawl, exposing a bruise on her wrist, dark purple and ugly against her skin. "I have nowhere else," she said to the dark. She took a step away from the porch, stumbling. Jed looked at the darkness beyond the fence. He thought of the tracks he had seen. He thought of the howling that had shaken the cabin walls the night before. "Wait," he said. She stopped but did not turn. "You cannot walk back to town tonight," Jed said. "It is 10 miles, and the temperature is dropping. And there are things out there you do not want to meet in the dark. I have no money to pay for a room," she said, her voice hard. "I did not ask for money," Jed said. "Come inside. I have stew on the fire. It is warm." She turned then, looking at him. She studied his face, looking for the cruelty she clearly expected to find. She looked at the rifle, then at his hands, then at his eyes. Jed stepped back and opened the door wider, letting the firelight spill out onto the snow. "I am alone here. Miss, you are safe enough." She hesitated for another long moment. then walked up the steps. She moved with a painful stiffness, favoring her right leg. As she passed him, he smelled the scent of wood smoke, old sweat, and fear. Inside, the cabin was simple. A table, 2 chairs, a bunk built into the wall, the stone fireplace. It was clean, but it felt empty. "Sit," Jed said, gesturing to the table. She sat, keeping her bundle in her lap. Jed ladled stew into a tin bowl and cut a thick slice of bread. He placed it in front of her, along with a mug of coffee. She ate slowly, deliberately, though he could see the hunger making her hands shake. She did not wolf it down like a starving animal. She ate with a dignity that made Jed look away to give her privacy. "I am Elena Reyes," she said after the bowl was empty. "Where did you come from?" "Elena?" Jed asked. He was cleaning the rifle again, sitting in the armchair, giving her space. "Texas," she said. "I came up on a wagon train as far as Denver, then hitched rides. I was looking for work. The town, your town." She stopped, her jaw tightening. "What did they do?" Jed asked. She looked at her hands. "I asked at the boarding house. The woman looked at me like I was dirt. She said they do not take drifters. I went to the saloon to ask if they needed a cleaner. The men—" She trailed off. She did not need to finish. Jed knew what the men in the saloon were like. He knew what they thought of a woman alone, especially a woman with skin that wasn't white. "One man followed me out," Elena said, her voice flat. "He said I looked like I needed a protector. He said he would take care of me if I was nice. I had to pull my knife to get away." Jed nodded slowly. "That sounds like Bitter Creek." "I am a widow," she said, lifting her chin as if daring him to challenge her. "My husband was a drover. He died on the trail 2 years ago. It was a hard life for a widow. Jed knew that. Without a man, a woman was considered prey or a burden." "Why did you come here?" Jed asked. "Because I have debts," she said. "My husband left debts. The men he owed, they said I was responsible. They took my house. They took everything. I had to leave or—" She stopped again, her eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp anger. "I am not a whore, Mr. Holt, and I am not a beggar. I work hard. I can cook. I can mend. I can handle horses. Carson promised me a job." Jed looked at her. He saw the split boots. He saw the bruises that she tried to hide by pulling her sleeves down. He saw a woman who had walked through fire and was still standing. He needed help. His knee was getting worse every day. He couldn't fix the roof and ride the fence and cook the meals. "I cannot pay much," Jed said. "The ranch is barely breaking even. But I can offer you a roof, a warm bed, food, and I will not ask you for anything else." Elena looked at him, searching his face again. "No questions?" "No questions," Jed said. "You do the work, you get the keep. Honest work for honest shelter. That is the deal. Not charity." Elena was silent for a long time. She looked around the cabin, at the solid logs, the fire, the absence of men who would hurt her. "I can sleep in the barn," she said. "You will freeze in the barn." Jed said, "You take the bunk. I will take the bedroll by the fire. My back prefers the floor anyway." She nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. "Deal." They fell into a rhythm over the next few weeks as late autumn bled into the hard white of winter. It was an uneasy partnership at first. They moved around each other like 2 stray dogs, careful not to invade the other's space. They spoke little. The silence of the ranch, which had been heavy with grief for Jed, began to change. It was still quiet, but it was a shared quiet. Jed showed her how to mix the feed for the horses. He watched as she chopped wood, her swing efficient and practiced. She hauled water from the creek, breaking the ice with a pry bar, her breath puffing white in the air. She never complained. She never asked for help. One afternoon, they were salting the last of the beef in the smokehouse. The air was pungent with brine and hickory. "Hand me that sack," Jed said, pointing to the coarse salt. Elena hefted the 50-pound sack and poured it over the meat. Jed watched her. She was stronger than she looked. "You have done this before." Jed said, "My father was a butcher." She said, "Before the war." She wiped her hands on her apron. Her face was smudged with soot, but she looked healthier than the day she arrived. The hollows in her cheeks were filling in. Jed found himself working harder, trying to hide his limp. He did not want her to see him as a cripple. He wanted to be the protector he had promised to be. One evening, the wind was particularly vicious, battering the cabin with gusts that sounded like fists. They had finished supper, a rabbit stew from the traps Elena had learned to check. Elena was sitting at the table, mending one of Jed's shirts. The firelight cast soft shadows on her face, softening the sharp angles. Jed was in his chair, whittling a new handle for the axe. He looked up and saw that her hands had stopped moving. Her head had dipped forward, her chin resting on her chest. The needle was still pinched between her fingers. She was asleep. She looked younger when she slept. The defensiveness was gone from her mouth. She looked exhausted, but peaceful. Jed stood up quietly, wincing as his knee popped. He moved across the room, his socks silent on the floorboards. He picked up the heavy wool blanket from the end of the bunk. He moved to the table and very gently draped it over her shoulders. Elena stirred but did not wake. She sighed, a long, soft sound, and pulled the blanket tighter around herself in her sleep. Jed stood there, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder. He felt a sudden, fierce tightening in his chest. It was not desire. Exactly. It was something older and more dangerous. It was the instinct to stand between a fragile thing and the dark. He wanted her to be safe. He wanted to keep the world from hurting her anymore. It frightened him. That feeling, it made him vulnerable. A man with nothing to lose is hard to break. A man with something to protect can be destroyed. He stepped back, retreating to the shadows of the fireplace. He sat down and stared into the flames, listening to the wind. Then he heard it. It was not a howl this time. It was a silence. The wind had not stopped, but the horses in the barn had gone deadly quiet. The usual shifting and stomping had ceased. Jed stood up and grabbed his rifle. He opened the door a crack, just enough to look out. The moon was behind the clouds, but the snow reflected a faint, ghostly luminescence. He looked toward the ridge line that overlooked the ranch house. At first, he saw nothing, just the jagged black shapes of the pines against the sky. Then, he saw the lights. They were twin points of pale yellow-green, appearing in the darkness. 2 eyes, then 2 more to the left, then 2 more. They flickered on like lamps being lit in a distant city. 10 pairs, 20, more. They were lining the ridge, looking down at the cabin. They were perfectly still. They were not milling about. They were watching. Jed felt a cold sweat break out on his back. He gripped the rifle so hard his knuckles turned white. He had never seen wolves behave like this. They were not just hunting, they were reconnoitering. He blinked, and in that split second, the lights vanished. It was as if the dark had opened its mouth and swallowed them whole. The ridge was empty again, save for the trees and the wind. Jed stood there for a long time, the cold air freezing the sweat on his skin. He looked back into the warm cabin, at Elena sleeping with her head on the table, wrapped in his blanket. He closed the door and slid the heavy oak bolt into place. "It begins," he whispered to the empty room. He went to the window and covered it with the heavy shutter, plunging the room into the dim orange glow of the dying fire. He did not put the rifle down. He sat in the chair, facing the door, and waited for the morning that felt 1,000 miles away. Winter did not arrive in the valley with a polite knock. It kicked the door down. By the first week of December, the snow had ceased to be a decoration on the peaks and had become a siege weapon. It fell in dry, hard pellets that hissed when they struck the ground, and then it crusted over under the pale, heatless sun, turning the valley floor into a sheet of abrasive white. The nights were the worst. The temperature dropped so low that the moisture in a man's breath froze instantly in his beard, forming icicles that pulled at the skin. The creek edges turned to glass, the water running black and sluggish beneath the expanding ice. Jed Holt moved through this frozen world with the grim determination of a man who had seen 30 such winters and respected every one of them. He taught Elena Reyes the rhythm of survival, knowing that in this country, ignorance was a grave marker. He taught her how to read the weather and the color of the western sky. A bruised purple meant wind. A milky white haze meant heavy snow. He showed her how to stack the firewood, bark side down to keep the rot out. Tight enough to keep mice from nesting, but with enough air to let the wood breathe and dry. "You have to listen to the horses," Jed told her one morning as they stood in the barn, the air thick with the smell of hay and manure. They were grooming the team. The horses were skittish, their ears swiveling toward the back wall, nostrils flared to test the drafts. "They know before we do," Jed said, running a brush over Rusty's flank. "If they bunch up, something is hunting. If they go dead still, something is already here." Elena listened, her hands moving steady and sure. She had a way with the animals that Jed had not expected. She did not baby them, but she did not bully them either. She spoke to them in low, rhythmic Spanish, a soft cadence that seemed to settle their nerves better than Jed's gruff commands ever had. She proved capable, more than capable. She was resilient in a way that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with will. When the water buckets froze solid, she took the axe and broke the ice without complaint. When the flour grew weevils, she sifted them out and baked the bread anyway, because waste was a sin. The cabin changed. It was a subtle shift, like the slow turning of a season. The heavy silence that had lived in the corners since Jed's family died began to retreat. There was the sound of a spoon scraping a pot, the scent of dried sage and rosemary hanging from the rafters, the warmth of a second body in the room, displacing the cold air. It felt dangerous to Jed. It felt like hope, and hope was a thing that could be taken away. He found himself lingering over his coffee in the morning, watching the way the gray light caught the side of her face, and then he would push the mug away angrily and go out into the cold, telling himself he was just an old fool getting soft in the head. But the wolves did not let them forget. 2 weeks into the deep freeze, Jed rode out to check the herd. He kept the cattle in the lower pasture, closer to the house, where the windbreak of cottonwoods offered some shelter. He counted them. 32 head. One was missing. He found the heifer 1/4 of a mile up the fence line. She was still alive, but she would not be for long. She was standing on 3 legs, her breath coming in ragged plumes of steam. Her right flank was torn open, a jagged, weeping wound that exposed the muscle. Jed dismounted, his stomach turning over. He had seen wolf kills before. Wolves usually hamstrung their prey, snapping at the tendons to bring the animal down. This was different. This was a slash, deep and reckless, as if the beast that made it had done it for the sheer pleasure of feeling skin part under teeth. He walked a circle around the heifer, his eyes on the snow. The tracks were there. They were the same ones he had seen on the road, large, heavy prints, but there were more of them now. They wove together, crossing and recrossing, braiding into a single confused highway of paw marks. It looked like a dozen wolves had moved as one fluid entity. Jed ended the heifer's suffering with a single shot from his Colt. The report cracked through the frozen air, echoing off the valley walls like a thunderclap. He stood for a moment, the smoking gun in his hand, looking at the gray horizon. They were testing him. They were bleeding his stock to see if he would fight back. "We have to go to town," Jed said when he returned to the cabin. Elena looked up from the wash basin, her hands red from the cold water. "Now? It will be dark in 4 hours. We go now," Jed said, his voice hard. "I need more wire, and I need to tell the sheriff. If this pack moves south, they will hit the Deering herds next. Even Deering deserves a warning. The ride to Bitter Creek was a punishment. The wind cut through their coats, finding every gap in the stitching." Elena rode an old roan mare Jed had saddled for her, sitting the horse with the natural balance of someone who had spent her life moving. When they tied up at the hitching rail, the town looked hunkered down, miserable and gray. Smoke pumped furiously from the chimneys. They went to the sheriff's office first. Sheriff Miller was a man whose primary qualification for the job was his size and his ability to ignore things that were difficult to solve. He sat behind his desk, nursing a mug of coffee that smelled like burnt chicory. Wolves. Jed, Miller said, leaning back in his chair. He wiped his mustache with the back of his hand. It is winter. Wolves eat cows. That is the way of the world. Not like this, Jed said, leaning his knuckles on the desk. They are packing up. Miller, I saw a sign for 30 or 40 animals moving together. They tore a heifer apart and left her standing. That is not hunger. That is sport. Miller chuckled. A wet, rattling sound. 40 wolves? You are telling me there is an army of wolves marching on the valley? Come on, Jed. You have been out there alone too long. The wind starts to sound like voices after a while. I am telling you what I saw. Jed snapped. Miller shrugged. Well, if they come into town, I will shoot them. Until then, it is your range. Holt, you handle it. Jed turned and walked out. His jaw set so hard his teeth ached. Elena followed him, silent. They went to the general store for the wire. The atmosphere inside was warmer, but the reception was colder. The store was crowded with men waiting out the afternoon chill, ranch hands, drifters, and the usual collection of town idlers. The conversation died when Elena walked in. It was not just that she was a woman. It was who she was. She was Mexican, and she was with Jed Holt, a man the town had already decided was a relic. Jed moved to the counter, ordering the wire and a case of cartridges. He could feel the eyes on his back. He could hear the whispers. She is the one, a voice murmured. Showed up out of nowhere. Bad luck follows people like that. Another voice answered, low but audible. First the drought south of here, now the winter. Jed stiffened. He glanced at Elena. She was standing by the stove, her face carefully blank, staring at the iron grating. She heard them. He knew she heard them. Silas Vane, Deering's foreman, was leaning against a barrel of pickles. He was picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. Heard you lost a heifer. Holt, Silas said loudly. Jed turned slowly. News travels fast. It does when you have got a mouthy neighbor. Silas grinned. Shame about the cow, but maybe it is a sign. What kind of sign? Jed asked. Silas gestured toward Elena with his toothpick. Then maybe you are bringing trouble on yourself, keeping company with strays. Wolves smell weakness. Jed, and they smell bad blood. Jed took a step forward, his hands curling into fists. You watch your mouth. Silas. Before Silas could answer, a man detached himself from the group near the back. He was tall, wearing a dirty canvas duster and a hat that had lost its shape years ago. He had a scar running through his eyebrow. I know you, the man said, pointing a finger at Elena. Elena flinched. She looked at the man, and her eyes went wide with recognition and fear. You are Reyes's woman, the man said, stepping closer. I saw you in Abilene. Your husband owed me $40 for a saddle when he died. Elena took a step back, hitting the stove. My husband is dead, she whispered. His debt is not, the man said. He grinned, revealing yellow teeth. And since he is not here to pay, I reckon his property has to settle up. You ran off before I could collect. He reached out, grabbing Elena's arm. She cried out, trying to pull away, but his grip was iron. You are coming with me, the man snarled. I will find a way for you to work it off. The room was silent. No one moved. The storekeeper watched, polishing a glass. Silas Vane watched, amused. Let her go. The voice was not loud. It was not a shout. It was a flat, quiet statement of fact. Jed stood 5 feet away. He had not drawn his gun, but his hand was resting near the holster. His posture had changed. The slump of age was gone. He stood with his weight balanced, his eyes locked on the man holding Elena. The man laughed. Stay out of this, old man. This is business. She is stolen property. She is my hired hand, Jed said. And she is under my protection, the man sneered. Your protection? You can barely walk. Grandpa, Jed did not blink. I can walk fine, and I can put a bullet through your left eye before you clear leather. Now, let her go. There was a silence in the room that was heavier than the winter air. It was the silence of violence waiting to happen. The man looked at Jed. He looked at the old cowboy's eyes, and he saw something there that made his smile falter. He saw the kind of stillness that comes from burying 3 sons and a wife and having nothing left to fear, the man released Elena's arm. She stumbled back, rubbing the red marks on her wrist. "You are making a mistake." "Halt," the man spat. "Shielding a debt dodger. She owes you nothing," Jed said. "If you have a claim, you bring it to the sheriff. If you touch her again, I will kill you." He looked around the room, meeting the gaze of every man there. "Anyone else have anything to say?" Silas Vane shrugged, looking away. "Not me, Jed. Just offering advice." Jed took the coil of wire from the counter. "Come on, Elena." They walked out into the biting wind. Elena was shaking. She climbed onto her horse, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. They rode out of town in silence. The snow began to fall again, hard and fast. When they were a mile out, safe in the white isolation of the range, Elena pulled her horse up. She bent over the saddle horn, her shoulders heaving. Jed stopped Rusty and looked back. He did not go to her. He sat his horse, waiting. "I'm sorry," she choked out, her voice thick with rage and shame. "I'm sorry I brought this to you." Jed looked at the gray sky. "You did not bring anything. Elena, that man brought his own ugliness. They think I am—" She stopped, unable to say the words. "I know what they think," Jed said. "Men like that need someone to blame for the cold and the empty pockets. It is easier to blame a woman than to blame the weather." He turned his horse back to the trail. "You do not owe them your fear, Elena, and you do not owe me an apology. Now let us ride. The wolves will be out soon." The ride back was grueling. By the time they reached the ranch, night had fallen, and Jed's knee was a screaming agony. He dismounted with difficulty, his leg nearly buckling under him. Elena saw it. She saw the way he grabbed the saddle fender to keep from falling. She put the horses away while Jed limped into the cabin to build up the fire. When she came in, he was sitting in his chair, his legs stretched out, his face gray with pain. He had a bottle of liniment on the table, but he hadn't opened it. Elena took off her coat and hung it by the door. She walked to the stove, poured hot water into a basin, and brought it to him. "Roll up your pant leg," she said. "I can do it," Jed grunted, reaching for the bottle. Elena moved his hand away. Her touch was firm. "You cannot reach the back of the knee without twisting it. Let me do it." Jed stiffened. "I am not an invalid." "Elena, I know you are not," she said softly. "But you are hurting, and we have work to do tomorrow. You need to be able to walk." She knelt on the floor in front of him. Jed hesitated, the pride fighting with the pain. Then, slowly, he rolled up the denim. His knee was swollen, the scar tissue purple and angry against the pale skin. It was an ugly thing, a map of old violence. Elena dipped a cloth in the hot water and laid it over the joint. Jed hissed through his teeth. "Sorry," she murmured. She dried the skin and poured the liniment into her hands. The smell of camphor and turpentine filled the room, sharp and medicinal. She began to rub it in. Her hands were rough, calloused from work, but her touch was gentle. She worked the oil into the tight muscles, her fingers finding the knots and easing them out. Jed stared at the top of her head. He watched the firelight catch the dark strands of her hair. He felt the warmth of her hands on his skin, and a sudden, confusing wave of emotion washed over him. It was shame. Yes, the shame of an old man needing care from a young woman, but beneath the shame was something else. A hunger for the touch, a longing to be held, to be tended to. He pulled his leg back abruptly. "That is enough." Elena looked up, startled. Her eyes met his. There was a moment, a heartbeat, where neither of them moved. The air between them seemed to charge, thick and heavy. She was close, too close. He could smell the soap she used, the scent of the cold air still clinging to her clothes. "Thank you," Jed said, his voice rougher than he intended. Elena stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked away, a flush rising on her neck. "You are welcome." She went to the other side of the room to start supper. They moved around each other carefully that evening. When their hands brushed as she passed him a mug of coffee, they both pulled back as if burned. They became hyper-aware of the silence, filling it with unnecessary tasks. That night, the wolves came back. They did not howl this time. They yipped. It was a high, chaotic sound, moving around the perimeter of the ranch. One moment it was near the barn, the next it was by the creek, then up on the ridge. It was like a net being drawn tight. The cattle bunched against the corral fence, the wood groaning under their weight. Jed stood by the window, peering through the slit in the shutter. "They are testing the wire," he said. He spent the next day turning the ranch into a fortress. He took tin cans from the trash heap, old peach cans, bean cans, and filled them with pebbles and broken glass. He strung them on a line of twine around the perimeter of the corral and the house. At knee height, "If anything pushes through, we will hear it," he said. He hung lanterns high on the fence posts, keeping them unlit but ready to be fired. He dug a fire pit near the barn door, stacking brush and oil-soaked rags nearby. Then he took the spare rifle, an old Spencer carbine, down from the wall. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked Elena. "I can shoot a pistol," she said. "My husband taught me. A pistol is for a card game." Jed said, "This is for survival." He took her out behind the barn. He pinned a piece of paper to a fence post. "Put the stock against your shoulder. Tight," he instructed. "If you leave a gap, the kick will bruise you. Look down the barrel. Line up the notch with the bead." Elena raised the rifle. The barrel wavered. "Breathe," Jed said, stepping in close behind her. He could feel the heat of her body. "Do not hold your breath. Breathe out, and when your lungs are empty, that is when you are steady. Squeeze. Do not pull." She fired. The shot went high, kicking up snow above the post. "Again," Jed said patiently. "It is not about being fast. It is about being right. Discipline." Elena. Panic misses. Discipline hits. They spent an hour there, until her shoulder was sore and her hands were numb. But she was hitting the paper. That evening, the tension in the cabin was different. It was not just the fear of the wolves. It was the weight of the things they hadn't said. Elena sat at the table, cleaning the carbine. Jed was oiling his boots. "Why did you marry him?" Jed asked suddenly. He hadn't meant to ask, but the silence had become too loud. Elena stopped wiping the barrel. She didn't look up. "My father owed money. A lot of money. Reyes was a drover, but he had cash. He offered to pay the debt if he could take me north." She looked at the fire. "It was a trade. My father was a good man, but he was desperate. And Reyes, he wasn't cruel, not really. He just didn't care. I was just another thing he owned, like his saddle, like his horse." She looked at Jed, her eyes hard. "I promised myself when he died that I would never belong to anyone again, that I would never be traded to settle a score." Jed nodded slowly. "That is why you were ready to run when you got here." "Yes." Jed looked at his hands. They were gnarled, the knuckles swollen. "I had a woman once, Sarah, back before the war." Elena watched him, listening. "She wanted to settle down," Jed said softly. "She wanted a house in the valley, kids. But I wanted to see what was over the next ridge. I was young, and I had a lot of pride. I told her to wait. I told her I would be back in a year." He paused, the memory tasting like ash in his mouth. "I was gone 3 years. When I came back, she was married to a merchant in Boise. She had a baby. She looked at me like I was a stranger." He looked up at Elena. "I chose the trail. I chose the pride, and I have carried that stone every day since." The room was very quiet. The wind rattled the door latch. Suddenly, outside, the tin cans jangled, a sharp, metallic crash that sounded like shattering glass. Jed was up in an instant, blowing out the lamp. He grabbed his Winchester. Elena grabbed the carbine. They stood in the dark, hearts hammering. Silence. Then, the sound of hoofbeats. Heavy, panic-stricken hoofbeats from the corral. "They are inside," Jed hissed. He threw open the door. The night was a swirling vortex of snow. He could see shapes moving near the corral, shadows that flowed like oil. He raised the rifle and fired into the air, the flash blinding him for a second. "Get back!" Elena fired the carbine, the boom echoing. The shapes scattered. They dissolved into the white curtain of the storm. Jed ran to the corral. The horses were wild with fear, kicking at the rails, but they were safe. The wolves had not gotten in. They had just spooked them. He checked the perimeter. The tin can line was broken. The tracks were there, huge, deep prints right up to the house. They went back inside, shaking from the cold and the adrenaline. Jed barred the door. He turned to Elena. She was standing by the table, the carbine still in her hands. She was trembling violently. Jed put his rifle down and walked over to her. "Elena?" She looked at him, and her face crumbled. She dropped the gun and gripped the front of his shirt, her fingers digging into the wool. "I do not want to die." "Jed," she whispered, her voice fierce and breaking. "I do not want to die out here in the snow." "You are not going to die," Jed said, putting his hands on her arms to steady her. "I do not want to die like a ghost," she said, looking up at him, her eyes searching his face. "I do not want to die unseen, unloved. I have spent my whole life being invisible." Something in Jed broke. The wall he had built around himself, the wall of grief and age and stubborn solitude, cracked wide open. He cupped her face in his rough hands. Her skin was warm, so warm against the cold that was inside him. "Elena." He choked out. He kissed her. It wasn't a smooth kiss. It was desperate. It was the collision of two people who were terrified and lonely and alive. He kissed her like he was drowning and she was air. He kissed her like it scared him. How much he meant it. Elena made a sound in her throat and pressed closer, her hands moving up to grip his neck. For a moment, the wolves and the winter and the town didn't exist. There was only the fire and the taste of her. They pulled back, gasping, their foreheads resting against each other. Jed's hands were shaking. He looked at her, seeing her clearly. Not a stray, not a hired hand, but Elena. We have to survive this," Jed whispered. His voice was ragged. "We have to get through the winter." Elena nodded, her eyes bright with tears and fire. "Yes, we cannot do this if we are dead," Jed said, trying to find his balance. It felt like a lie. It felt like he was pushing away the only good thing that had happened to him in years. But he knew, with the certainty of a man who knew the wild, that distraction meant death. Elena stepped back slowly. She touched her lips. "Okay," she said softly. "First, we live." They slept in shifts that night, fully dressed, guns in their laps, but the air between them had changed. It was no longer just a partnership. It was a promise. Morning came with a deceptive calm. The wind had died. The sun was out, blindingly bright on the snow. Jed went out to check the tin line. He followed the tracks backward, away from the house, trying to see where they had breached the perimeter. The tracks led north, toward the boundary line with the double-barred D. Jed walked, leaning on his rifle, his bad knee protesting the deep snow. He followed the trail for half a mile. He crested a small rise and stopped. There, about 50 yards from his fence line, was a carcass. It wasn't a cow, it was a deer, but it hadn't died naturally. It was lying in a patch of trampled snow. Jed walked down to it. The deer had been cut open. The entrails were spilled out. Frozen now, but wrapped around the rib cage, glinting in the sun, was a piece of baling wire, and stuck in the frozen meat was a distinct boot print. Someone had dragged the carcass here. Someone had staked it down. Jed knelt, touching the wire. It was bait. They weren't just being hunted by wolves. Someone was drawing the pack in. Someone was laying a trail of blood right to his door. He looked toward the deering land in the distance. A cold rage, colder than the winter, settled in his gut. He stood up, looking back at the cabin where Elena was waiting. "They want a war," he whispered. He racked the lever of his Winchester, chambering around. Then they will get one. January buried the valley in a silence so deep it felt heavy enough to break the roof beams. The snowdrifts along the fence line rose taller than the cedar posts, turning the landscape into a smooth, deceptive ocean of white where a man could step into a hollow and disappear up to his chest. The sky was no longer a dome of air but a low ceiling of hammered lead, pressing down on the mountains until the peaks seemed to bow under the weight. Jed Holt moved through the drifts with the grim persistence of a man walking into a headwind that had not stopped for 40 days. His face was windburned to the color of raw beef. The skin around his eyes crinkled permanently against the glare. Every breath was a negotiation with the cold. The wolves were changing. In the early weeks, they had been shadows at the edge of the firelight, nightmares that vanished with the sun. Now, they were bold. Jed heard them during the daylight hours, a chorus of yips and howls that echoed off the canyon walls, mocking the noon sun. They were testing the range of the rifle, appearing on the ridge lines in plain sight, gaunt, gray shapes that sat on their haunches and watched the ranch house with a terrifying patience. The cattle were losing condition fast. It was not just the scarcity of the winter grass, buried deep under the crust. It was the stress. The herd stood bunched in the lower pasture, heads down, ribs showing through their winter coats like the staves of a barrel. They did not eat. They watched. They slept in fitful, twitching bursts, terror burning the fat off their bodies faster than the cold. Jed rode out on Rusty, the big bay gelding stepping high and careful through the drifts. He was following a hunch and a set of tracks that did not belong to an animal. He found it near the eastern boundary, where the land rose toward the timber line bordering Ralph Deering's vast holdings. It was a carcass of a pronghorn doe. It lay in a small clearing, the snow around it trampled flat, but it was not a kill site. There was no spray of blood, no drag marks from a chase. The doe lay perfectly centered in the clearing. Her belly slid open with a precision that spoke of a skinning knife, not a tearing tooth. Jed dismounted, his knee protesting with a sharp, hot grind. He dug into the snow around the doe's neck. His gloved fingers brushed against cold metal. Wire, baling wire, was wrapped around the doe's neck and staked deep into the frozen earth, hidden beneath the snow. It was an anchor. It was bait meant to stay in place, to draw the predators in and hold them there, close to Jed's land, training them like dogs to a food bowl. He widened his search, circling the clearing. He found what he knew he would find, though the discovery made his stomach turn over. Boot prints. They were partially filled with fresh powder, but the outline was clear. A heavy boot, a man's weight. And alongside the boot prints were the massive, splayed tracks of the wolves, mingling with the human sign as if the two species were partners in this business. Jed stood up, wiping the snow from his gloves. The cold that settled in his chest had nothing to do with the weather. This was not nature. Nature was cruel, but it was honest. This was a man's hand turning the wild into a weapon. "We are going to town," Jed said when he walked back into the cabin. Elena looked up from the stove, where she was boiling laundry. She saw the look on his face, the set of his jaw that looked like trap iron. She did not argue. She dried her hands and reached for her coat. The ride to Bitter Creek was a slog. The horses labored in the deep powder, their breath pluming like steam engines. When they arrived, the town looked brittle, the wooden buildings shrinking inward against the frost. Jed found Silas Vane holding court on the boardwalk outside the saloon, wrapped in a buffalo coat that cost more than Jed's entire herd. The foreman was smoking a cigar, the smoke hanging stagnant in the freezing air. "You are putting bait out." "Silas," Jed said. He did not raise his voice, but the conversation on the boardwalk died instantly. Silas turned slowly, feigning surprise. He took the cigar from his mouth and inspected the ash. "Is that a greeting, Holt? Because where I come from, a man usually says hello before he starts throwing accusations. I found a doe wired down near the boundary line," Jed said, stepping up onto the wood planks. "Gutted with a knife, staked with baling wire, and boot prints leading back to your range." Silas smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. His eyes were like polished stones. "A dead deer? In winter? Imagine that. Maybe a hunter lost his kill." "Maybe you are seeing things again. Old man, you are drawing them in," Jed said, his voice tightening. "You are baiting the packs to the edge of my land. You want them to clear me out so Deering can walk in and take the water rights without firing a shot." Silas took a step forward, dropping the pretense of amusement. "Listen to me, Holt. You go around spreading talk like that, saying Ralph Deering is conspiring with wolves, and you are going to find yourself in a cell for slander. Or worse." "Worse," Jed challenged. Accidents happen on the range, Silas said softly. A man riding alone. A horse stumbles. A gun goes off cleaning it. It is a dangerous country. You ought to be careful. Jed held his ground, though his hand twitched near his hip. I am not the one who needs to be careful. Silas, when a man feeds a fire, he best make sure he does not get burned when the wind changes. He turned and walked away, leaving Silas staring at his back with a look of pure venom. While Jed was locking horns with the foreman, Elena was fighting a different kind of battle at the general store. She had gone in to buy salt and sewing thread. The store was warm, smelling of spices and dry goods. Mrs. Gable, the wife of the town's banker and a pillar of the local church, was standing by the fabric counter. She was a woman who wore her piety like armor, stiff and unyielding. Elena kept her head down, moving quickly to get what she needed. She felt the eyes on her. It was a physical sensation, like a prickling on the back of her neck. She placed her coins on the counter. The clerk took them with 2 fingers, as if they were infectious. You are still out there. I see, Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was loud, intended for the audience of 2 other women browsing the ribbons. Elena turned slowly. Yes, ma'am. It is mighty charitable of Mr. Holt to keep you. Mrs. Gable said, sniffing. A woman in your situation. Most decent men would not want the scandal under their roof. I work for my keep, Elena said, her voice steady though her heart hammered against her ribs. I earn my place. Work, Mrs. Gable echoed, exchanging a knowing look with the other women. I suppose there are names for that kind of work. You should be grateful, girl. Gratitude is a virtue. Though I shudder to think what kind of sin you are bringing to that poor man's door. The Bible says trouble follows the wicked, and looking at this winter, I would say trouble has surely arrived. Elena felt the blood rush to her face. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell this woman about the nights spent hauling water until her hands bled, about the fear that lived in the walls, about the cold that never left her bones. Instead, she straightened her spine. She lifted her chin, looking Mrs. Gable in the eye. Mr. Holt is a good man, Elena said clearly, and God sees what happens in the dark. Mrs. Gable. He sees who works, and he sees who judges. She picked up her parcel and walked out. She walked with dignity, her boots thudding on the floorboards. But inside, she was crumbling. The humiliation was a corrosive acid. It ate at her. Was it true? Was she a curse? Was she bringing this darkness down on the only man who had shown her kindness? She met Jed by the horses. He saw the glitter of unshed tears in her eyes and the tight line of her mouth. He did not ask. He knew this town. They were about to mount up when Sheriff Miller stepped out of his office. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand. Hold up, Jed, Miller called out. Jed paused, 1 foot in the stirrup. What is it? Miller. Papers, the sheriff said, thrusting the documents at Jed. Court summons, and a notice of lien. Lien? Jed took the papers, scanning them with disbelief. What are you talking about? Unpaid grazing fees, Miller said, looking bored. And a dispute filed by the Deering estate regarding the water rights to the upper creek. They say you have been damming the flow illegally. I have never dammed that creek in my life, Jed shouted, the paper crinkling in his fist. Tell it to the judge, Miller said. Hearing is set for spring. Until then, there is a hold on your assets. If you cannot pay the fees by the 1st of the month, the county takes the land to auction. It is a lie, Jed said, his voice shaking with rage. It is a squeeze. Deering owns the judge. Miller shrugged. It is the law. Jed, I just served the papers. Jed crumpled the papers into his pocket. He looked at the sheriff, then at the town that had turned its back on him. Come on, Elena, they wrote out, the weight of the injustice pressing down harder than the snow. We need to know the truth, Jed said as they cleared the town limits. Not about the law, about the wolves. He turned Rusty off the main road, heading toward a plume of smoke rising from a draw in the foothills. Where are we going? Elena asked, her voice dull. To see Elias. Jed said, he has trapped these mountains since before the war. If anyone knows what is happening with the packs, it is him. Elias lived in a dugout cut into the side of a hill, the front faced with logs and sod. The inside smelled of cured fur, wood smoke, an unwashed man. Elias was as old as the mountains, his face a map of wrinkles hidden behind a beard that looked like a bird's nest. He welcomed them with a grunt and a pot of tea made from pine needles and bark. "They are not right," Elias said, after Jed told him about the bait. He sat on a stump, whittling a stick. "The wolves, they are not acting right." "How?" Jed asked. "Too many," Elias said, "driven down. There is heavy gunfire up north, in the Montana territory. Big bounties. They are pushing the packs south, but it is more than that." He looked at Jed with rheumy, pale eyes. "Deering has hired men, not cowboys. Hunters, I've seen them. They are not shooting to kill, mostly. They are using poison." "Poison," Elena whispered. "Strychnine." Elias nodded. "Nasty stuff. Makes the animal burn from the inside out. But here is the thing. If a wolf takes a sublethal dose, or if they eat the meat of a poisoned kin, it twists them, drives them mad, takes away the fear of man, makes them desperate. So he is poisoning them to kill them. And the ones that survive, Jed started, are turning into devils." Elias finished. "He is breeding a nightmare. Jed, he is driving them insane with pain and hunger, and then leading them right to your doorstep with that bait." The ride back to the ranch was silent. The horror of it settled over them. It wasn't just greed. It was a violation of the natural order so profound it felt blasphemous. A mile from the ranch, Jed pulled Rusty up sharp. "Look," he said, pointing to a drift near a stand of aspens. An animal was thrashing in the snow. It was a wolf, a large male, gaunt and ragged. It was not attacking. It was dying. They rode closer. The wolf was convulsing, its back arching in unnatural, rigid spasms. Foam, pink with blood, frothed around its muzzle. Its eyes were glazed and rolling, wide with a terror that went beyond instinct. It snapped at the air, biting at invisible enemies, chewing its own tongue. It whined, a high, pitiful sound that sounded like a crying child. Elena turned her face away, burying it in her scarf. "Oh, God!" Jed dismounted. He walked toward the wolf. The animal tried to rise, to snarl, but its legs collapsed. It looked at Jed, and in that look, there was no malice, only agony. It was a victim, just like the heifer, just like Jed and Elena. It was a creature of the wild, twisted and tortured by the greed of a man who sat in a warm house and signed papers. Jed drew his revolver. His hand was shaking, not from fear, but from a profound, aching sorrow. "I am sorry," he whispered. He aimed behind the ear and fired. The wolf slumped. The thrashing stopped. The red stain spread slowly across the white snow. Jed stood there for a long time, looking down at the body. He holstered the gun and wiped his hand across his face. When he turned back to the horses, he looked older. Elena was watching him. She saw the tears in his eyes. She saw the way his shoulders slumped with the weight of the mercy he had just delivered. He was not the hard, careless man the town said he was. He was not a relic. He was a man who felt the pain of the world and tried to answer it with decency. And in that moment, the ache in her chest changed. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was love. A love so sharp it felt like a wound. That night, the wind howled around the cabin, mimicking the voices of the dead wolves. The cabin felt smaller, the walls pressing in. They ate in silence, but it was a companionable silence. They were soldiers in the same trench now. After supper, they sat by the fire. Jed was cleaning the revolver. The smell of a gun oil sharp in the room. Elena was staring into the flames. "They say I am a sin," Elena said quietly. Her voice was small. "Mrs. Gable. She said I bring trouble." Jed stopped cleaning. He looked at her. "Mrs. Gable reads the Bible, but she does not know the author." Elena looked up, her eyes swimming. "Maybe she is right. Maybe I am a burden. You are losing everything. Jed, the land, the cattle. Maybe if you left, I would be alone," Jed said. "You were alone before. I was waiting to die before," Jed said. There is a difference. He put the gun down on the table. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. You are not a burden. Elena, you are the only thing in this valley that makes sense. Elena stood up. She crossed the small distance between them. She stood before him, the firelight catching the tears on her cheeks. I do not want to be just a hired hand, she whispered. I do not want to be a charity case. I want... She hesitated, her breath catching. What do you want? Jed asked. His voice rough. I want to be wanted, she said. Not because I am useful, not because I am safe, but because I am me. I want to be wanted without shame. Jed stood up. He ignored the pain in his knee. He reached out and took her hands. They were rough, calloused hands, just like his. He pulled her closer. He looked into her dark eyes and saw the fear and the hope warring there. You are not a debt, Elena, he said fiercely. You are not an object to be traded, and you are not alone. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. She felt solid and real and warm. He kissed her. It started gentle, a reassurance. But then the dam broke. The months of fear, the isolation, the adrenaline of survival, it all poured into that kiss. He kissed her until she gasped, her hands gripping his shoulders, her body pressing against his. He kissed her until the cold world outside ceased to exist, and there was only the heat of the fire and the heat of their blood. He pulled back, breathing hard, his forehead resting against hers. He wanted her. God, he wanted her. Every part of him ached with it. But he stopped. He stopped because the wolf was dead in the snow. He stopped because the sheriff was coming for the land. He stopped because if they crossed this line, and then they died, it would be a tragedy he couldn't bear. We can't, he whispered, his voice shaking. Not yet. Not while they are at the door. Elena nodded, her eyes dark and heavy. She understood. But the restraint was a physical pain. It hung in the air between them, a charged current that made every glance, every brush of a sleeve, feel like lightning. They slept in their separate beds, but the space between them vibrated with the things they hadn't done. 3 days later, the violence escalated. Jed was mending a harness when the news came. A rider from the Circle K, a young man who looked pale and shaken, stopped at the gate. Did you hear? The boy asked, his voice trembling. Hear what? Jed asked. Schmidt, the German fellow over in the next valley. I know him. Jed said. Hard worker. Quiet. He is dead, the boy said. Wolves took him. Jed went cold. Took him? He was trying to get his stock into the barn. They say he went out to grab his youngest girl, who had run out after a calf. The pack hit them right in the yard. He threw the girl into the loft, but they dragged him down. The boy swallowed hard. They say there was nothing left but bones and boots. Mr. Holt. Jed gripped the fence post. It had happened. The line had been crossed. The town is going crazy. The boy continued. They are scared, and they are angry. Sheriff Miller told folks at the saloon that your ranch is the source. He says you are attracting them. He says... What does he say? Jed asked quietly. He says that woman you have got. He says she is a witch, that she called the beasts down from the hills. People are talking about riding out here. Jed looked at the boy. Go home, son. Lock your doors. He walked back to the cabin. Elena was churning butter. She saw his face and stopped. Schmidt is dead. Jed said, wolves, and the town blames us. He went to the window and began to board it up with heavy planks he had cut the day before. We are under siege. Elena, he said, it is not just the wolves anymore. They spent the next 2 days turning the ranch into a fortress. They moved the remaining stock into the high corral, reinforcing the rails with fresh timber. They boiled water in great copper tubs, keeping it scalding hot on the stove. They sharpened every axe, every knife, every scythe on the place. They stacked ammunition on the table, boxes of .44, 40 loose rounds for the shotgun, the heavy buffalo slugs for the Sharps rifle. They did not sleep. They napped in shifts, fully dressed, boots on, but they could not defend against treachery. It was a moonless night, the wind howling so loud it drowned out thought. Jed was on watch at the front window. Elena was in the back, watching the ridge. The betrayal came from the south. Someone, a man from town, desperate for coin or approval from Deering, had sold the information. They knew Jed was watching the north ridge. They knew the stock was bunched in the barn. Jed smelled it before he saw it. The smell of kerosene. Fire! He screamed. He threw the door open. The back wall of the barn was aflame. The fire was climbing the dry wood with terrifying speed. Whipped by the wind, the horses were screaming inside. "Get the buckets!" Jed roared, limping toward the inferno. Elena was already running. She grabbed 2 pails of water and sprinted into the smoke. They fought the fire with a desperation that burned their lungs. They threw water, snow, anything they could find. The heat was searing, singing their eyebrows, blistering their skin. "Get the horses out!" Jed yelled. Elena ran into the burning structure. She came out leading the team, slapping their rumps to send them scattering into the corral. She went back in for the milk cow. Jed was beating the flames with a wet saddle blanket, coughing violently. They managed to kill the fire, but the cost was high. One side of the barn was charred black. The winter hay supply, tons of dry grass meant to feed the herd until spring, was a smoking, soggy ruin. They stood in the snow, covered in soot, gasping for air. The barn still stood, and the animals were alive. But without the hay, the herd would starve. Jed looked at the darkness beyond the light of the dying embers. He saw boot prints leading away from the back of the barn. Human prints. "They tried to burn us out," Jed rasped. Elena wiped her face, leaving a streak of black ash across her cheek. She looked like a warrior from an ancient story. "We are still here," she said. But as the adrenaline faded, a new sound began to rise. It started in the north, deep in Deering's territory. A howl, long, mournful, and hungry. Then another joined it from the east, then the west. The sound layered over itself, voice upon voice, pack upon pack. It wasn't the chaotic yipping of the night before. This was a convergence. It sounded like the earth itself was screaming. It filled the valley. It vibrated in the charred wood of the barn. It rattled the bones in Jed's chest. "That is not 20 wolves," Jed whispered. He looked at Elena. The dread on her face mirrored his own. It sounded like hundreds. It sounded like a tide of teeth and hunger that had finally arrived to wipe the valley clean. 300, Jed said, the number tasting like ash in his mouth. He gripped Elena's hand. "Get inside," he said. "Tonight is the night." They retreated into the cabin, bolting the heavy door against the storm, the smoke, and the fate that was gathering in the dark. The 300 was no longer a number. It was the end of the world. The day did not break so much as it bruised the horizon. The dawn bled into the valley with a sickly, gray pallor, bringing with it a silence so absolute it felt heavy enough to crush the lungs. There were no birds. The usual morning chorus of chickadees and jays, the chatter of the squirrels in the pines, the distant caw of a raven, all of it had been wiped clean. The air hung suspended, thick and motionless, carrying the metallic taste of a snow that was gathering its strength in the clouds above but had not yet fallen. Jed Holt stepped out onto the porch, his breath pluming white and vanishing instantly in the dry cold. He walked to the rail, gripping the rough wood with a gloved hand. His horse, Rusty, stood in the corral with his head low, ears swiveling frantically toward the north, then the west, then the east. The bay gelding let out a low, nervous whinny that sounded too loud in the quiet. Jed saddled Rusty with difficulty, his fingers stiff and clumsy. He had to see. He had to know the shape of the thing that was coming for them. He rode the perimeter of the ranch, keeping close to the fence line. The snow from the previous weeks lay deep and crusted, but fresh signs were everywhere. It looked as though the ground had been stitched with paw marks. They were not the tracks of a single pack. They were a convergence. Trails led down from the high sawtooths. Deep ruts plowed through the drifts by heavy bodies moving in single file. Other trails came up from the lowlands, from the direction of the Deering Range. They circled the ranch like a noose, tightening. Jed stopped the horse at the rise overlooking the house. He looked down at the snow. It was churned to a pulp. Thousands of prints. They had been here in the night, silently measuring the fences, testing the wind, smelling the fear in the cattle. It was not a hunt. It was a siege. He turned Rusty back toward the cabin, pushing the horse through the drifts. When he reached the yard, Elena was waiting on the porch. She was wearing her coat, her small bundle of belongings sitting at her feet. Her face was pale, her eyes dark with a terror she was trying to master. "We should go," she said as soon as he dismounted. Jed tied the reins to the rail. He did not look at the bundle. "Go where, Elena?" "To town," she said, her voice rising. "To the church. Anywhere but here. You saw the tracks. You heard them last night. We will never make it," Jed said. He walked past her, checking the load in his Winchester. "We have to try," Elena said, grabbing his arm. "Jed, look at the sky. Look at the horses. We cannot fight this alone." Jed stopped. He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then up at her face. "If we leave," he said quietly. "Deering wins." Elena stared at him. "Deering? He wants us off the land," Jed said. "If we run, the wolves will tear the stock to pieces. The bank will foreclose on a ranch with no assets. Deering will sweep in and take the water rights before the snow melts. He wins without firing a shot," Jed said, his voice hard. "And we become exactly what they say we are. Drifters. Beggars." Elena looked at the bundle at her feet, then back at the dark timberline. "Is a ranch worth dying for?" she asked. "It is not about the ranch anymore," Jed said. "It is about whether we're going to let them break us. If we run now, we run forever." He stepped inside the cabin. Elena stood on the porch for a long moment. The silence of the valley pressed against her ears. She looked at the horizon, where the clouds were turning a color like a bruise. She looked at the cabin door. She picked up her bundle, walked inside, and set it down in the corner. "Tell me what to do," she said. They spent the remaining hours of daylight turning the homestead into a fortification. They worked with a frantic, focused energy, speaking only in short commands. "Fill the lanterns," Jed said. "All of them, even the broken one. We need light." Elena trimmed wicks and poured kerosene until the cabin smelled sharp and chemical. Jed went to the barn. He brought the milk cow and her calf into the lean-to attached to the main cabin, barricading them in with heavy oak planks. He moved Rusty and the two other best horses into the center stalls of the barn. Reinforcing the doors with cross beams he nailed into the frame. The rest of the herd had to stay in the corral. It was a gamble, but there was no room for 30 head of cattle inside. Jed reinforced the corral fence, lashing extra rails to the posts with baling wire, weaving a barrier of thorns and brush into the gaps. They brought everything they could use inside the main house: axes, the pitchfork, a heavy iron pry bar. They stacked firewood near the hearth until it reached the window ledge. By late afternoon, the air changed. The heavy stillness broke, replaced by a low, moaning wind that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The light began to fail. It was not a normal sunset. The sun simply dissolved behind a wall of gray, and the world turned the color of ash. "We eat now," Jed said. Elena put a pot of beans and salt pork on the table. They sat opposite each other. The food was hot, but neither of them tasted it. The cabin felt small, a tiny wooden box floating in a vast, hostile ocean. Jed looked at Elena across the table. Her hair was pulled back, revealing the sharp line of her jaw. There was a smudge of soot on her forehead. She looked tired, but her eyes were clear. She was watching him. She was looking at the lines around his eyes, the shape of his nose, the way his hands held the spoon. She was looking at him the way a person looks at a landmark they want to remember when they are lost. Jed reached across the table. He covered her hand with his. His palm was rough, calloused and scarred. Her hand was smaller, but strong, the fingers gripping his instantly. They did not speak. There were no words that fit the size of the night that was coming. They just held on, anchoring each other to the earth, feeling the pulse of blood that was warm and alive in a world that wanted them cold and dead. Then the wind screamed. It hit the house with a physical impact. shaking the logs in their notches. The door rattled violently in its frame. Jed stood up, releasing her hand. He went to the window and peered through the slit in the shutter. "Here it comes," he said. The blizzard did not fall. It drove. The snow came sideways, a blinding white curtain that erased the barn, the corral, and the mountains in a single breath. Visibility collapsed to zero. And with the snow came the shadows. They appeared first as ghosts in the whiteout, shapes that were darker than the storm, moving with a fluid, liquid grace. Then the lights, eyes, dozens of them, then scores. They caught the reflection of the light seeping through the cracks in the shutters, yellow, green, amber. They circled the house, a moving ring of bioluminescence. Jed picked up the Winchester. "You take the north window," he said. "Keep the shutter latched, but use the loophole. Do not fire unless they try to breach." Elena picked up the Spencer carbine. She moved to the back of the room, her face set in a grim mask. The pressure began. It was not an attack yet. It was a wait. The wolves pressed against the walls of the cabin, scratching at the logs. They could hear the heavy, wet sound of bodies thumping against the wood. The click of claws on the door. Something hit the tin can alarm line Jed had strung around the porch. The rattle was sharp and discordant, sounding like dry bones shaking in a cup. "They are at the door," Jed whispered. He stood back from the entrance, leveling the rifle. A heavy weight slammed against the oak planks. The door groaned, dust sifting down from the lintel. Another impact, then another. They were testing the hinges. Jed waited. He did not fire. He had limited ammunition, and he would not waste it on wood. "From the north window!" Elena gasped. "What is it?" Jed asked, not looking away from the door. "They are climbing the drifts," she said, her voice trembling. "The snow is drifting against the wall. They are right at the window." A snout pushed through the loophole. Black lips, bared white teeth. A low, vibrating growl that filled the room. Elena screamed. The carbine boomed. The smell of black powder filled the small space, acrid and sulphurous. The snout vanished in a spray of red mist. A yelp cut through the wind, followed by the sound of a heavy body sliding down the logs. Elena dropped the gun to her side. She was shaking violently, great racking sobs tearing from her throat. She stared at the loophole, her eyes wide with horror. It was not the fear of death. It was the shock of violence, the intimacy of taking a life, even a beast's, at point-blank range. Jed moved to her. He did not touch her, but he put his body between her and the window for a second. "Good shot," he said. His voice was flat, steady, cutting through her panic. "You bought us time. Reload." "Elena." She looked at him, tears streaming down her face. She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve. She fumbled a fresh cartridge from her pocket and jammed it into the breech. They came in waves after that. The attack was relentless. It felt orchestrated. One group would hit the front door while another scrambled at the roof, their claws scrabbling on the shingles. The sound was deafening. The wind, the growls, the scratching, the gunshots. The ranch felt like a small island of wood and warmth surrounded by a rising tide of hunger. Jed fired through the door loop, dropping a wolf that was gnawing at the threshold. He moved to the side window, firing into a mass of shapes that were tearing at the corner of the cabin. "How many?" Elena cried out. "Firing again. Too many," Jed answered. Then the scream came. It was a horse. It came from the corral. It was high and shrill, a sound of absolute terror and pain that cut through the storm like a knife. "Rusty," Elena gasped. "No," Jed said. "Listening. It is one of the Colts." She made a move toward the door. "We have to help them." Jed grabbed her. He dropped his rifle and seized her shoulders, spinning her around. "No!" he shouted. "Let me go!" she screamed, struggling against him. "They are killing them. If you go out there, you die," Jed yelled, shaking her. "The storm will swallow you. Elena, you will be gone in 3 steps." She fought him. She struck his chest with her fists, furious, desperate, tears flying from her eyes. She hated the helplessness. She hated the cruelty of the night. "Let me go," she sobbed. Jed pulled her in. He wrapped his arms around her, pinning her arms to her sides. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair. "I cannot lose you," he said. "I cannot lose you." She broke. The fight went out of her, and she collapsed against him, gripping his coat, weeping into his chest. He held her like a man holding the last warm thing in the world, while outside the wind howled and the horse screamed one last time, and then fell silent. The silence that followed was worse. It was the silence of feeding. They stood there for a moment, breathing together, hearts hammering in unison. Then, a crash. The shutter on the south window splintered. A massive gray wolf, driven by madness and hunger, smashed its head through the wood, snapping at the air inside the room. Glass shattered. The cold wind blasted in, carrying snow and the stench of wet fur. "Back!" Jed roared. He shoved Elena toward the trap door in the floor. "The root cellar. Get down." He fired the Winchester from the hip. The bullet took the wolf in the shoulder, knocking it back, but another was already pushing behind it. Jed grabbed a lantern and threw it at the window. The glass broke and the kerosene ignited. A sheet of fire flared up, momentarily driving the beasts back. He grabbed the handle of the trapdoor and yanked it open. "Down!" Elena scrambled down the ladder. Jed threw the ammo boxes down after her, then dropped into the hole, pulling the heavy door shut above them. He slid the bolt home. They were in the dark, smelling of earth and potatoes and fear. Above them, they could hear the thumping of paws on the floorboards. The wolves were in the house. Jed struck a match. The small flame illuminated their faces, streaked with soot, sweat, and blood. Elena was sitting on a sack of turnips, her carbine across her knees. She looked up at him. "They are inside," she whispered. "Just the front room," Jed said, his voice shaking. "The fire will keep them back for a minute, but we cannot stay here. If the house burned, they would suffocate or roast." Elena looked at him. In the flickering light of the match, her face was stripped of all pretense. There was no social standing here, no past, no debt. "I never chose anything," she said suddenly. Jed looked at her, the match burning down toward his fingers. "What? My life," she said. "My father chose my husband. My husband chose his debts. The town chose to hate me. I never chose." She stood up. She stepped close to him in the cramped space. "I choose this," she said fiercely. "I choose to be here. With you." Jed dropped the match. It went out, but he didn't light another. He reached out in the dark and found her face. "I am terrified," he confessed. His voice cracked. "I am terrified of dying, Elena, but more than that, I am terrified of leaving you alone. I am terrified of leaving you to the same cruelty you ran from." He ran his thumb over her cheekbone. "I love you," he said. It was not poetry. It was plain. It was heavy. It was said like a man confessing a crime or stating a fatal truth. Elena let out a sob that sounded like a laugh. She gripped his shirt front. She pulled him down to her. They kissed. It was a kiss of hunger and grief braided together. It was desperate. Their teeth clashed. Their hands gripped tight enough to bruise. It was a claiming. In the dark, with the monsters above them and the fire crackling. They poured everything they had into that contact. It stopped just short of what the night would not allow. They pulled back, breath rasping, foreheads touching. "We are not going to die in a hole," Jed whispered. "No," Elena said. "We are not going to let them take this," Jed said. He pushed up on the trap door. It held. The wolves had moved off the hatch. He opened it an inch. Smoke drifted down. But the fire had not caught the logs yet. The wolves had retreated from the sudden flare of the lantern. Jed pushed the door open. He climbed out, Winchester ready. The room was a wreck. The window was shattered, the curtains smoldering, but the cabin was clear. "Get the brush piles," Jed yelled. They had prepared for this. Outside the back door, Jed had stacked great piles of dried sagebrush and oil-soaked rags. He kicked the back door open. The wind caught the door and slammed it against the wall. He threw a burning brand from the fireplace into the nearest brush pile. The sage exploded into light. The wind whipped the flames high, casting a brilliant, dancing orange glow across the snow. The light revealed the enemy. The 300. They were everywhere. The yard was a sea of fur. They stood on the drifts, on the roof of the shed, on the fence rails. Their eyes reflected the firelight in hundreds of pairs of glowing orbs. It looked like an army. It looked like the earth had opened up and vomited every predator in the territory onto this 1 acre of land. The fire spooked them. They drew back, snarling, shading their eyes. "Now!" Jed shouted. He began to fire. He didn't aim for kills. He fired to scatter, to break the line. Elena joined him, the boom of the carbine adding to the rhythm. They used the fire to force the wolves into narrow approaches. The wolves, driven by the madness of the poison and the bait, kept coming, but they were funneled now. Jed saw the gate to the high corral, where the horses were, begin to buckle. A mass of wolves was pushing against it. "If that gate goes, Rusty is dead," Jed said. He didn't think. He didn't weigh the odds. He ran. He ran out into the storm, into the teeth of the pack. He limped, his bad knee screaming, but he moved with a speed born of pure adrenaline. "Jed!" Elena screamed. He reached the gate. He jammed his shoulder against the wood. Shoving the wolves back, he fumbled with the latch, trying to secure the crossbar that had splintered. A wolf leaped from the top rail. It hit Jed in the chest, knocking him into the snow. His knee gave out. He felt the ligament tear, a hot, sickening pop. He fell. The wolf was on him, jaws snapping at his throat. Jed jammed the stock of the Winchester into its mouth, holding the teeth back. Another wolf grabbed his boot, another bit into his shoulder, the teeth tearing through the heavy sheepskin coat. He was going down. He was drowning in fur and snow. Then, a scream of pure fury. Elena. She ran out of the cabin. She did not take cover. She ran straight into the swarm, firing the carbine from the hip. Boom! 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 She cleared a path. She reached Jed and swung the empty rifle like a club, smashing it across the snout of the wolf on his chest. "Get up!" she screamed. "I can't," Jed gasped. "My knee." She grabbed his collar. She dug her heels into the snow. She dragged him backward, firing her pistol with her other hand. She was a demon. She was a force of nature. She dragged him to the porch steps. She hauled him up, ignoring the wolves snapping at her skirts. They fell through the doorway. Elena kicked the door shut and dropped the bar. They lay on the floor, gasping, bleeding, alive. Outside, the storm raged on. The battle lasted until the sky began to turn the color of old iron. It was a blur of noise and recoil. They fired until the barrels of their guns were too hot to touch. They fired until their shoulders were bruised black and blue. But slowly, the pressure eased. The fire had done its work. The noise had broken their nerve. The unnatural aggression fueled by the poison began to fade as the instinct for self-preservation returned. Near dawn, the wind died. The howling stopped. Jed pulled himself up to the window. They were retreating. Some were dead in the yard, black shapes half buried in the drifts. Others were limping away, leaving trails of blood. The main pack was moving off toward the timberline, fading into the white, as if the storm was calling them back. "They are going," Jed whispered. He slid down the wall. His leg was useless. His shoulder was bleeding freely now. He felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. Elena crawled to him. She was covered in soot, her hair wild, her coat torn. "Jed," she said, touching his face. "I am tired." "Elena," he mumbled. His eyes fluttered shut. "I just need to rest a minute." "No," she said firmly. She pressed her forehead against his. "No sleeping. Jed, not yet." She shook him gently. "You have to see it." "See what?" he whispered. "The morning," she said. "You have to see the morning." She held him there, keeping him tethered to the world with her voice and her hands. Outside, the clouds broke. A single shaft of pale, cold sunlight pierced the gloom. It struck the snow, illuminating the blood, the carcasses, and the battered, scorched wood of the ranch. The ranch stood. It was scarred. It was marked with blood. But it was standing. The sun that climbed over the eastern peaks did not bring warmth, but it brought a light so unforgiving it made the eyes ache. It illuminated the valley floor with a clarity that stripped away all denial. The snow around the Holt Ranch was no longer white. It was a churned, muddy ruin, stained with great swaths of crimson that had frozen into dark. Jagged crystals, carcasses littered the yard. Gray and black shapes lay half buried in the drifts, their fur matted with ice. There were wolves draped over the fence rails where they had died trying to climb. There were bodies near the porch, stiff in the rigor of death, but it was the tracks that silenced the wind. The snow was beaten down so thoroughly by thousands of paws that it looked less like a ranch yard and more like a cattle trail cut by a massive herd. It was a highway of hunger that led straight to Jed Holt's door. The smoke from the partially burned barn had risen straight up in the still morning air, a black pillar acting as a beacon. By mid-morning, the town came. They rode in cautiously, a dozen men at first, followed by wagons carrying the curious and the fearful. Shopkeepers, ranch hands from the lowlands, the blacksmith, and the idle drinkers from the saloon. They stopped at the broken gate, their horses snorting at the heavy scent of blood and musk that hung over the place. No one laughed. The men who had mocked Jed at the general store, who had called him a senile old relic chasing shadows, sat on their horses with their mouths slightly open. They looked at the sheer number of dead wolves. They looked at the claw marks gouged deep into the logs of the cabin walls, some as high as a man's head. They looked at the brass casings scattered on the porch like fallen hail. "This does not look like 20 wolves," the blacksmith muttered, taking off his hat. "It looks like a war," another man said softly. The cabin door opened. Elena Reyes stepped out first. She was wrapped in a torn coat, her face smeared with soot and dried blood, her hair escaping its braid in wild strands. She looked exhausted, but she stood upright, holding the door frame. Jed followed her. He leaned heavily on a makeshift crutch whittled from a broom handle, his left leg dragged, useless and swollen. His shoulder was bandaged with strips of flannel that were already seeping red. He looked like a man who had been chewed up and spit out by the earth itself, but his eyes were hard and bright. He looked at the crowd. He did not speak. He simply let them look at them. "You are alive. Someone called out." "We are," Jed rasped. "No thanks to the help we did not get. Doc Evans, a man with a frayed medical bag and whiskey on his breath, pushed through the crowd. I had better look at that leg." Jed. While the doctor worked on the porch, cutting away the denim to reveal the ugly, purple swelling of the torn ligament and the ragged bite marks on the shoulder, the mood of the crowd began to shift. The shock was fading, and the old, comfortable habits of prejudice were creeping back in to fill the void. "It is unnatural." "Mrs.," Gable whispered to her husband, staring at the carnage. "Wolves do not act like this, not unless they are drawn. Maybe he baited them," a voice from the back suggested. "Maybe the old fool wanted a bounty and got more than he bargained for." "Or maybe it is her," another woman hissed, pointing a gloved finger at Elena. She stood by Jed's chair, handing the doctor clean rags, ignoring the stares. "Look at her. She brought this. Beasts follow their own kind." Elena heard them. Her hand trembled slightly as she held the basin of water, but she did not look up. She kept her eyes on Jed's face, anchoring herself to him. The crowd parted suddenly as a buggy arrived. Flanked by 3 riders, it was Ralph Deering, accompanied by Sheriff Miller. Deering stepped down, his boots polished, his coat heavy fur. He looked at the dead wolves with a curl of distaste, then walked up the steps. "My God, Jed," Deering said, his voice smooth and carrying a performance of concern. "What have you done? I survived." "Ralph," Jed said through gritted teeth as the doctor poured iodine on his shoulder. "Which is more than you planned on." Deering shook his head sadly. He turned to the sheriff. "Look at this, Miller. Look at the slaughter. This is reckless endangerment." The sheriff stepped up, thumbs hooked in his belt. He looked uncomfortable but rehearsed. "It is a mess. Deering, it is criminal." Deering corrected. "These animals were clearly baited. Holt here must have been luring them in for weeks." He has drawn a plague down on the entire valley just to prove a point. He has endangered every family in Bitter Creek." Jed pushed the doctor's hand away and tried to stand, but his knee buckled. He fell back into the chair, fury flushing his pale face. "That is a lie," Jed spat. "You know who baited them." "Deering, I found the carcass on your boundary line. Wired down. I saw your men's boot prints." Deering sighed, looking at the crowd with a pitying expression. "The man is delirious. Pain and isolation have finally snapped his mind. He's accusing me of baiting wolves to my own property line. It makes no sense. He wants me ruined," Jed said to the crowd. "He wants the water rights. He tried to burn me out last night. Look at the barn. Accidents happen with lanterns in a storm," the sheriff said dismissively. Deering nodded. "I think we have enough here to warrant an inquiry. Sheriff, illegal baiting of predators, discharging firearms within range of a public road, creating a public nuisance. I want him taken into custody until we can sort this out." The trap snapped shut. It was not about the wolves anymore. It was about the law, twisted by money until it strangled the truth. Elena stepped forward. She moved between Jed and the sheriff. She was small compared to the men, but she vibrated with a cold, sharp anger. "He did not bait them," she said, her voice ringing clear in the morning air. The sheriff looked down at her. "Step aside. Girl, this does not concern you. I saw the carcass." Elena said, "I saw the wire, and I saw the men who set the fire. I saw the tracks leading back to the double bar D." She pointed a shaking finger at Deering. "He hired men to poison them. That is why they were mad. That is why they attacked the house. He drove them here." The crowd murmured. Poison was a dirty word in cattle country. It was a coward's weapon. Deering laughed. A short, dismissive bark. "And who are you? A drifter with no name and a history of running from debts? You are hardly a credible witness." "My dear, you are hysterical. The shock of the night has clearly confused you." "She is unreliable," Sheriff Miller added, looking at the crowd. "We all know the stories. A woman alone, living in sin. She will say whatever he tells her to say." "I am telling the truth," Elena cried out. Deering stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menace. "You are a guest in this valley. Miss, and a tenuous one at that. I would be careful about slinging mud at your betters. The sexism and the racism were naked now, stripped of any polite veneer. To them, she was not a person. She was a complication to be brushed aside. I saw it too." The voice came from the edge of the yard. Elias, the old trapper, was leaning on his long rifle. He had walked down from the foothills, silent as a ghost. He was wearing skins that smelled of pine and old blood, and his eyes were sharp under his bushy brows. "I saw Deering's men," Elias said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. 3 days ago, hauling meat soaked in strychnine, up near the North Ridge." The crowd went silent. Elias was a hermit, but he was white, and he was a fixture of the mountains. He did not lie. Deering's smile faltered. "You are mistaken, old man. I do not make mistakes about tracks," Elias said, "and I do not make mistakes about poison. I saw the wolves foaming at the mouth. I saw them turning on each other. You drove them mad, Deering, and you drove them south." The sheriff shifted his weight. "Now, Elias, let us not be hasty." "Ain't nothing hasty about it," Elias said. "Jed is telling the truth." Deering's face hardened. He looked at the crowd, gauging their reaction. He saw doubt. He saw the beginning of anger. "We will discuss this in town." Deering snapped. "Sheriff, serve the papers for the lien. We will let the judge decide who is reliable." He turned on his heel and marched back to his buggy. The sheriff threw a folded document into Jed's lap. "You have got until the 1st of the month to pay the fees. Holt, or the ranch goes to auction." They rode away, leaving a wake of uneasy silence. The doctor finished binding Jed's knee. "You need to stay off this for a month. Jed, if you walk on it, you will be crippled for life." Jed looked at the paper in his lap. "I do not have a month." Later that afternoon, the threats began in earnest. Elena rode into town to buy antiseptic and bandages. Jed had tried to stop her, but she refused to let him ride. When she came out of the apothecary, 2 men were waiting. They were not locals. They were hard-faced men with dusters covering their guns. Deering's hired hands. One of them stepped in her path. "You have got a big mouth for a little lady," he said, leaning down. Elena tried to step around him. "Excuse me." He blocked her again. "Mister, Deering is a forgiving man, but he does not like liars. If you were smart, you would pack that little bundle of yours and keep moving. Before something happens." "Are you threatening me?" Elena asked, her hand going to the knife she now carried in her belt. "Just advice." The man smiled. "Fires happen. People disappear on the road. It is a dangerous country." He reached out and stroked her cheek with a dirty finger. "A pretty thing like you. It would be a shame to see you get hurt." Elena slapped his hand away and backed toward her horse. She mounted with trembling legs and rode out, the sound of their laughter following her. When she got back to the ranch, she found Jed sitting on the porch, cleaning his revolver. He saw her face, the pale, tight look of fear. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low. She told him. Jed's face went dark. He tried to stand, reaching for his crutch. "I will kill them. I will ride in there and kill them both." He stumbled, gasping as pain shot up his leg. Elena rushed to him, catching him before he fell. "Stop," she said, holding him up. "Stop it, Jed. That is what they want. They want you to come into town waving a gun so the sheriff can shoot you down." Jed gripped the rail, his knuckles white. "They touched you. They are trying to scare us." Elena said, "It is working," Jed admitted, sagging against her. They sat on the porch step as the sun went down. The ranch was quiet. The dead wolves finally hauled away to a burn pile by Elias and a few shamefaced neighbors. Elena was trembling. The adrenaline of the night battle had faded, leaving her hollow and shaking. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "I'm afraid they will win." Jed put his good arm around her. He pulled her close, letting her head rest on his shoulder. "They will not win," he said, "but we have to be smart. We cannot fight them with guns alone." He looked at her, his expression serious. "Marry me," he said. Elena pulled back, staring at him. "What? Marry me?" Jed repeated. "Tomorrow." Elena searched his face. "Jed, you do not have to do that. You do not have to save me." "It is not about saving you," Jed said. "Well, not only that. In this territory, a wife has rights a hired hand does not. If they arrest me, you can hold the land. If I die, the deed passes to you, not the bank. It gives you standing. It makes you a Holt." Elena looked down at her hands. "Is that why? For the deed?" Jed reached out and lifted her chin. "No, that is the reason for the timing. The reason for the asking." He hesitated, searching for the words. "I do not want to be alone anymore. Elena, I want to wake up and see you. I want to build this place back up with you. You stood with me when the world was ending. There is no one else I would trust with my life." He brushed a stray hair from her forehead. "I love you. I told you that in the cellar, and I meant it." Elena's eyes filled with tears. She nodded slowly. "Yes." They rode to the church the next morning. It was a bleak, gray day. Jed had to be helped down from the wagon. Elena wore her best dress, which was still mended and worn, but she had washed her hair and braided it tight. The Reverend was hesitant. He looked at Elena's dark skin, then at Jed's battered condition. "This is highly irregular," the Reverend said. "Do it," Jed said, "or I will find a judge who will." The ceremony was short. There were no flowers. The witnesses were Elias and the doctor. When they walked out of the church, a group of women was standing on the boardwalk. Mrs. Gable was there. Shameful. One of them whispered loudly. "An old man and a Mexican stray. It is a mockery. He just wants a nurse," another said, "and she just wants his money." Jed stopped. He leaned on his crutch and looked at them. "She is my wife," he said, his voice carrying across the street. "And she has more courage in her little finger than this whole town has in its spine." He helped Elena into the wagon and they drove away, heads high, stubborn as the winter grass pushing through the snow. 2 days later, the break came. Elias rode out to the ranch at dawn. He had a man tied to his pack mule. The man was young, barely 20. He was shivering, his face bruised. It was one of the drifters who had been hanging around the Double Bar D. "Found him trying to sneak out of the valley," Elias said, dumping the man into the snow. He had a bag full of Deering's coin and a guilty conscience. Jed hobbled out to the porch. "Who is he?" "Name is Tom," Elias said. "He was the one who bought the strychnine." Jed looked at the boy. "Is that true?" The boy nodded, terrified. "I did not know he was going to use it like that." "Mr. Holt, I thought it was for coyotes, but then he made us drag the carcasses. He made us wire them down." "And the fire?" Jed asked. The boy flinched. "That was Silas. He said we had to flush you out." Jed looked at Elena. "We have got him?" They did not go to the sheriff alone. They gathered the town. Jed sent word through Elias and the doctor. He called for a meeting at the town hall. He knew Deering owned the law, but he could not own the whole town if the truth was shouted loud enough. The hall was packed. The air was thick with tension and the smell of damp wool. Deering sat in the front row, looking bored and annoyed. Sheriff Miller stood by the door, hand on his gun. Jed stood on the stage, leaning on the podium to take the weight off his leg. Elena stood right beside him. She did not hide. She looked out at the faces that had scorned her. "Ralph Deering has accused me of baiting wolves," Jed began. "He has accused me of negligence. He has placed a lien on my land for debts I do not owe." He motioned to Elias. "Bring him out." Elias dragged the boy, Tom, onto the stage. The boy was weeping. He told his story. He told it in halting, frightened sentences, but the details were too specific to be made up. The purchase of the poison in Montana, the specific instructions from Silas Vane. The night they crept onto Jed's land to set the fire, the room went deadly quiet. Deering stood up, his face red. "This is absurd. The boy is a liar. He was fired for drinking." "Holt has paid him to say this. I did not pay him," Jed said. "But I have the receipt for the poison." He held up a crumpled piece of paper Elias had found in the boy's saddlebag. It was dated and signed. "And I have the surveyor's original map," Jed continued, pulling a scroll from his coat. "Found in the county archives. It shows the water rights belong to the Holt claim, not the Double Bar D. The markers were moved." He looked at the sheriff. "Arrest him." "Miller." The sheriff looked at Deering. He looked at the crowd. The mood had shifted. The fear that had gripped the town, the fear of the wolves, the fear of the winter, was turning into anger. They realized they had been played. Their panic had been manufactured to help a rich man get richer. "That is enough." "Miller," Deering snapped. "Clear the room. This is a farce." Miller did not move. "I said clear the room," Deering shouted. "You used us." "Ralph," the blacksmith said, standing up. "You brought those wolves down on us. My brother lost 3 calves. Schmidt lost his life. That blood is on your hands." Another man yelled. Deering looked around. Realizing his power was cracking, he signaled to Silas Vane, who was standing near the back. Silas reached for his gun. "Do not!" Jed shouted, drawing his own revolver with a lightning speed. The room erupted into chaos. Men dove for cover. Silas froze, looking down the barrel of Jed's Colt. "Drop it, Silas," Jed said. "It is over." Silas hesitated, then slowly dropped his gun. The sheriff, seeing the tide turn, finally stepped forward. He put a hand on Deering's shoulder. "I think you had better come with me. Mr. Deering, for your own safety, if nothing else." Deering was led away, shouting threats of lawsuits and ruin. But as he passed Jed, he looked small. It wasn't over, though. A wounded animal bites hardest. That night, Jed and Elena rode back to the ranch. The moon was hidden by clouds. They were exhausted, but victorious. The lien would be lifted. The investigation had begun. They were a mile from the gate when Rusty threw his head up. Jed sensed it a second before it happened. The silence was wrong. "Ambush!" Jed yelled. He slapped the reins, driving the wagon off the road just as muzzle flashes sparked from the rocks above them. Bullets splintered the wood of the wagon seat. "Get down!" Jed shouted, pushing Elena to the floorboards. He returned fire, the boom of his Colt rolling through the dark. It was the last of Deering's hired men, the ones who knew they would hang if they were caught. They were pinned down. The horses were screaming. "Elena, take the reins," Jed grunted. He handed her the lines and grabbed the shotgun from under the seat. "Drive!" he roared. "Drive right at them!" "Are you crazy?" Elena screamed. "They expect us to run!" Jed yelled, "Drive!" Elena whipped the team. The horses surged forward, crashing through the brush, heading straight for the rocks where the gunfire originated. The audacity of it stunned the ambushers. They expected a retreat, not a charge. Jed stood up in the bouncing wagon, ignoring the agony in his knee. He leveled the shotgun. Two shapes rose up from the rocks. Jed fired, both barrels. The spread of buckshot swept the rocks. One man went down screaming. The other scrambled back, dropping his rifle, and ran into the dark. Elena wrestled the team back onto the road, her arms shaking. "Keep going," Jed said. "Reloading. Do not stop until the gate." They made it to the ranch. They barred the door and waited, but no one else came. The power of the double-barred D had been broken in the town hall and shattered on the road. The next morning, the news arrived with the doctor. Deering was in a cell in the county seat. Silas Vane had fled the territory. The town looked different when they went in to sign the final papers. People did not stare with scorn. They tipped their hats. The merchant at the store hurried to open the door for Elena. It was not that they suddenly loved her. It was that they respected her. She had stood in the fire and not burned. She was a Holt now. And in the West, that name meant something again. Jed walked out of the sheriff's office, leaning on his crutch. Elena walked beside him, her hand on his arm. "It is done," Jed said. "The land is safe." Elena looked at the mountains. The snow was beginning to melt on the south slopes. "We survived the winter," she said softly. Jed looked at her. He saw the strength in her face, the beauty that had nothing to do with features and everything to do with spirit. "We did more than survive," he said. He kissed her forehead. "Right there on the main street of Bitter Creek. Not caring who saw, let us go home, wife." The thaw did not arrive with grace. It came as a violent unraveling of the winter's work. In early March, the wind shifted from the north to the southwest, bringing a warm, wet breath that smelled of rot and mud. The great drifts that had besieged the cabin for months began to collapse into themselves, turning heavy and gray. The creek, which had been a silent ribbon of ice, shattered its casing and roared to life, swollen with meltwater, tearing at its banks like a brown, angry snake. The valley floor turned into a quagmire. It was an ugly season. The receding snow revealed the broken bones of the land, shattered fence rails, the sodden black ruin of the haystack, and the earth scarred by the thousands of claws that had fought there. Jed Holt and Elena Holt stepped out into this mud not with despair, but with the grim determination of people who had cheated death and knew the cost of the ticket. Rebuilding was not a swift task. It was a slow, aching grind. Jed's knee was stiff, the joint grinding audibly in the damp air, forcing him to move with a persistent limp. Elena worked beside him, her boots caked with 3 pounds of clay, her hands roughened by wet rope and splintered wood. They started with the fences. They had to dig new post holes in the semi-frozen muck, tamping the earth down around fresh cedar logs. It was brutal work. Every rail lifted was a defiance. Every nail driven home was a statement that they were staying. They buried the dead stock that had been revealed by the thaw, the calves that hadn't survived the cold, the few cows that had died of stress. They dug the graves on the high ground, away from the water table. Jed said a few words over each one. He did not treat them as lost money. He treated them as lives that had been under his care, lives he had failed to protect perfectly. It felt like choosing life again and again, one shovelful of dirt at a time. One afternoon, while patching the roof where the wolves had torn at the shingles, Elena stopped. She sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with a muddy glove. She looked out over the valley. The willows near the creek were turning a startling, vivid yellow-green. The first blades of grass were pushing through the mud, stubborn and sharp. "It is going to be green," she said, sounding surprised. Jed looked up from the ground where he was sawing a plank. He shielded his eyes against the glare. "It always comes back, Elena," he said. "The land does not hold a grudge. It just waits." The town of Bitter Creek was also thawing, though the mud there was of a different kind. Jed and Elena rode in every Sunday. It was a calculated risk. They refused to hide. They refused to let the town forget that they were still standing. The reception was divided. The shame of the Wolf Night, as people were calling it, hung heavy over the community. Some folks, the blacksmith, the miller, the families who had lost stock to Deering's manufactured plague, tipped their hats with genuine respect. They would stop Jed in the street to ask about his knee or ask Elena about her garden. It was an apology without the words, a peace offering made of small courtesies. But others kept their distance. The women who had gossiped in the general store now turned their backs when Elena entered, pretending to be fascinated by bolts of calico. The men who had laughed at Jed now looked at him with a sullen resentment, as if his survival was an insult to their judgment. Elena learned quickly that acceptance was not a gift. It was territory. You had to take it and hold it. She walked into the general store with her head high, when Mrs. Gable tried to cut in front of her at the counter. Elena did not step back. She stood her ground, her shoulder brushing the older woman's silk sleeve with her worn wool coat. "I believe I was next. Mrs. Gable," Elena said, her voice pleasant but immovable. "Mrs." Gable spluttered, looked at the clerk, and then, seeing no support, retreated. Elena bought her flour and walked out, her heart hammering but her face calm. Justice, when it came, was dry and bureaucratic. The inquiry into Ralph Deering's actions was held in the county seat, presided over by a circuit judge who had no patience for cattle barons playing God. The testimony of the boy, Tom, and the evidence of the surveyor's maps were damning. Deering was not jailed. Men with his money rarely saw the inside of a cell for long, but he was bled. The judge slapped him with a fine of $5,000 for reckless endangerment and illegal poisoning. More importantly, the court nullified his claim on the Upper Creek boundary. The water rights were returned to the Holt deed, ironclad and permanent. Sheriff Miller did not fare as well. The town council, embarrassed by the national news coverage of the 300 Wolf siege, quietly asked for his resignation. He was replaced by a younger man, a former Texas Ranger named Clay Thorne, who looked at the law as a straight line, not a suggestion. But for Jed, the legal victory was not enough. At the first town meeting of the spring, Jed stood up. He leaned on his cane, the room falling silent. He looked older, his hair completely white now, but his voice had regained its timbre. "We beat Deering," Jed said to the room, "but we have not beaten the problem." He looked around at the ranchers. "I hear talk of bounties. I hear men saying we need to go into the hills and wipe every wolf out of the sawtooths. I hear talk of more poison." He paused, letting the word hang there. "Poison is what brought this on us." Jed said, "You throw strychnine into the wild. You do not just kill a wolf. You kill the birds that eat the carcass. You kill the water, and you drive the survivors mad." Some of the men grumbled. "They are just varmints. Holt, kill them all and be done with it. If you kill them all, the deer herds will explode." Jed countered. "They will eat your grass down to the root. Then the starvation comes. It is a balance. You break it, you pay for it. I fought 300 of them. I know what they can do. But I also know that a starving, poisoned animal is a man-made horror, not a natural one." He sat down. There was no applause. Some men glared at him with open hatred, seeing him as a traitor to his own kind. But others, the older men who remembered the way the land used to be, nodded slowly. He had earned the right to speak. He had paid for his opinion in blood. Elena found her own voice in a quieter, but no less powerful way. It started with the widow who ran the bakery. The woman was illiterate, struggling to make sense of the invoices from the flour mill. Elena, waiting for bread one morning, saw the woman weeping over a ledger. "May I help?" Elena asked. She spent an hour sorting the papers, her mind sharp and quick with the numbers she had learned from her father's business. She found an error that saved the widow $10. Word spread. It turned out that Elena Reyes, now Elena Holt, could read, write, and cipher better than half the merchants in town. Soon, she was holding informal classes in the back of the church on Tuesday afternoons. She taught farm children their letters. She helped women read the contracts their husbands were signing. She became useful, and in a hard country, utility was the first step toward respect. She was no longer just the Mexican stray. She was the woman who knew how to balance a ledger. She was someone the town could not afford to ignore. But the past has a long memory. In late April, when the mud had dried to hard ruts and the cottonwoods were fully leafed, a stranger rode into Bitter Creek. He was a thin man in a dusty suit, carrying a leather satchel. He had the pinched, hungry look of a bureaucrat who enjoyed his work too much. His name was Garrick, and he held the notes on the debts Elena's first husband had left behind. He rode straight to the Holt Ranch. Jed was in the corral, working a young colt. Elena was in the garden, planting rows of beans. Garrick did not dismount. He sat on his horse, looking down at Elena with a sneer of recognition. "Mrs. Reyes," he said, "you are a hard woman to track." "My name is Holt," Elena said, standing up and wiping dirt from her hands. She did not tremble this time. She did not look for an exit. Garrick chuckled, opening his satchel. "A change of name does not erase a ledger. My dear, I have a court order from Texas. Your late husband's debts amount to $400, plus interest, plus the cost of my travel." He looked at the ranch house, assessing its value. "Since you have no assets, the law allows for indentured service to work off the claim. Or perhaps your new protector has the coin." Jed came out of the corral. He walked with his cane, but he moved with a dangerous fluidity. He stopped beside Elena. "Get off my land," Jed said. Garrick sighed. "I have paper, Mr. Holt, legal paper. If you interfere, I will have the sheriff out here to levy your stock." "I said get off my land," Jed repeated. Garrick stiffened. "I will be back with the law." He rode away. That night, Jed went to the tin box under the floorboards where he kept his savings. He counted it out. $70. It was everything they had. "It is not enough," Jed said, staring at the coins. Elena put her hand over his. "We are not paying him." "Jed, he has a court order." Jed said, "They will take the cattle. Let them try." Elena said. The next day, they rode into town. Garrick was waiting at the sheriff's office with Clay Thorne. Thorne looked apologetic. "Jed, this man has a valid writ from Texas. The debt is real." Jed stepped forward, placing his hand on the counter. He laid down a piece of paper. It was his marriage license. "She is my wife," Jed said, "under the law of this territory. A wife is not liable for the debts of a deceased spouse incurred in another jurisdiction prior to the marriage." "I looked it up." Garrick scoffed. "That is a technicality. She is the beneficiary of the estate." "There was no estate," Elena said, stepping forward. Her voice was not loud, but it filled the room. She stood in the center of the office, surrounded by men, and she did not shrink. He died with nothing. Elena said, "You took the house, you took the horses, you took everything but the clothes on my back. The debt was paid in flesh and property." She looked at Garrick. "You are not here for money. You are here because you think you own me. You think because I am a woman, because I am Mexican, that I am just another line in your book." She took a breath. "I am no one's property. I am Elena Holt. I survived the winter. I survived the wolves. Do you think I am afraid of a man with a satchel?" The room went silent. Sheriff Thorne looked at Garrick. "She makes a good point," the sheriff said, "and I have checked the statutes myself. The Texas writ has no jurisdiction over the Holt Ranch. Unless you want to file a new suit in this county, which will take about 6 months to schedule, you are out of luck." Garrick's face turned purple. "This is thievery." Thorne smiled. A cold, thin expression. "No, sir, this is the West. We do things a little differently here. I suggest you get back on your horse." Garrick looked at Jed, then at Elena. He saw the wall of resolve they had built. He snapped his satchel shut and stormed out. Elena let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 2 years. Jed put his arm around her. They stood there in the daylight, prejudice challenged and broken not by hiding, but by standing still. That evening, the ranch felt different. The shadow of the past had finally lifted. They heated water in the big copper tub in front of the fire. Outside, the spring peepers were singing in the creek, a chorus of life that replaced the howling of the winter. Elena bathed first, then Jed. Afterward, wearing clean cotton, they sat by the fire. Jed looked at his hands. They were spotted with age, the knuckles swollen. He looked at Elena, her skin smooth in the firelight, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. "I am old." "Elena," he said quietly. It was a confession he had been afraid to make. "I look in the mirror and I see a wreck. I limp. I ache when it rains. You are young. You could have had—" Elena moved from her chair. She knelt in front of him. She took his face in her hands. She looked at the scars on his neck. She looked at the lines etched by the wind. "I see a man who stood when everyone else ran." She said, "I see the hands that built this house. I see the only man who ever looked at me and saw a person." She kissed his palm. "Do not talk to me about age. Jed, the wolves did not care about your age, and neither do I." She pulled him up. The pain in his knee was there, but it didn't matter. They danced. There was no music, only the crackle of the fire and the song of the frogs. They moved slowly around the small room. It was an intimate, vivid moment. It was not the frantic, desperate passion of the root cellar. It was something deeper. It was the quiet, terrifying safety of being known and loved anyway. He kissed her, and the hunger was there, sharp and sweet. But the shame was gone. They were husband and wife, partners in a war they had won. May brought the wildflowers, blue bonnets and paintbrush splashing color across the slopes. It also brought Caleb. He was a drifter, no more than 14 years old, skinny as a rail and skittish as a wild colt. He showed up at the gate asking for water. He had run away from a hard situation in Wyoming, carrying nothing but a worn coat and a desire to not be hit anymore. Jed looked at the boy. He saw the fear in his eyes. He saw the way the boy watched his hands, expecting a blow. He saw himself 40 years ago, and he saw the sons he had lost. "We need a hand," Jed said, leaning on the gate. "Fences need mending. Pay is $5 a month and board." The boy blinked, stunned. I do not know much about fencing." "Sir, you will learn," Jed said. "Put your horse in the barn. Wash up for supper." Elena watched from the porch. She saw the way Jed looked at the boy, stern, but with a hidden softness. She smiled. They were building a family. It was not a family of blood, inherited and taken for granted. It was a family of choice, stitched together from broken pieces to make something whole. They honored the wolves, in their own way. There were no more indiscriminate hunts. Jed bought 2 Great Pyrenees dogs, massive white animals that lived with the herd. He tightened the night corrals. He rode the range differently, moving the cattle to avoid the deep dens in the high timber. "The wolves are neighbors," he told Caleb one day as they rode the line. "You do not have to like your neighbors, but you have to respect their fences if you want them to respect yours." The land was wild. It demanded a tithe. They paid it with vigilance, not with slaughter. One morning in late May, the town came out. It was a Sunday. They didn't come with wagons of supplies or doctors this time. They came on horses and in buggies, dressed in their church clothes. They rode up the long drive to the Holt Ranch. The mud was gone. The lower meadow was a sea of emerald green, the grass waving in the warm wind. The barn had been repaired, the black scars covered with fresh timber. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. The scars of the battle were still there, the claw marks on the logs, the new rails in the fence, but they were healing. Jed and Elena walked out onto the porch. Caleb stood behind them, looking nervous. Mrs. Gable was there, the blacksmith, the new sheriff. "We just wanted to see," the blacksmith said, shifting in his saddle. "See what?" Jed asked. "See if it was true." The man said, "That you made it back." Jed looked at Elena. She smiled, and it was a smile of pure triumph. "We are here," she said. No one laughed. The memory of the 300 had become a legend in the valley, a story told in hushed tones to children. The morning after still lived in their minds. The blood, the tracks, the impossible survival. They looked at Jed and Elena not as outcasts, but as something formidable. They were the people who had held the line. The crowd lingered for a while, trading small talk about the weather and the price of beef. And then they drifted away, leaving the ranch to its peace. Jed and Elena remained on the porch as the sun climbed higher. The light turned the dew on the grass into diamonds. "It is a good morning," Jed said. He put his arm around his wife. He felt the warmth of her through her dress. He felt the solid wood of the porch beneath his boots. "We paid a high price for it," Elena said, leaning into him. "We did," Jed agreed. He looked out at the valley, scarred but beginning again. He thought about the fear that had ruled him for so long, the fear of being alone, the fear of being useless. It was gone. It had burned up in the sagebrush fires. He looked at Elena. "I would do it again," he said. "The wolves, the cold, the fire. I would do it all again." "Why?" she asked, looking up at him. "Because it brought you to the door," he said. He kissed her. It was a kiss with the certainty of iron. It was not a wish. It was a fact. They turned and looked at the ranch. The chimney smoke rose straight and true. The cattle grazed in the distance, fat and calm. The boy, Caleb, was walking toward the barn, whistling a tune. Two people who had survived both nature and cruelty stood in the sun, building something tender in a world that had tried so hard to make them stone. They were not stone. They were alive. And that was victory enough. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Jed and Elena as much as I enjoyed bringing it to life for you. It is a tale of resilience, the harsh beauty of the American West, and the enduring power of love in the face of impossible odds. I would love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? Please leave a comment and let me know which part of the world you are connecting from today. Share your thoughts. What did you think of the ending? Did Jed and Elena's fight for survival resonate with you? Please share your thoughts and feelings in English in the comments below. Please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of grit, glory, and the human spirit on the frontier. Your support helps keep these legends alive. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.